Um, okay, all set, yeah. Hello, thank you for attending the 8th annual Startup Boston Week. My name is Harish.
I'll probably do most choice of any stuff on the taxes slide.
All right, thank you. So thank you once again for attending the 8th annual Startup Boston Week. My name is Harish, and I will be your host for today. A huge thank you first for our sponsor, Suffolk University's Sawyer Business School, for hosting this conference. As you may have noticed arriving, this downtown location is the perfect hub for exploring Boston's innovation ecosystem and learning from industry leaders. The goal behind Startup Boston Week is to connect the entire greater Boston and New England startup community across all industries, all startup departments, and all bootstrapped and funding stages for 5 days of learning and connecting with one another. The team that creates Startup Boston Week is primarily volunteer, and the folks working the conference today are all volunteering their time as well. So thank you for attending this conference. It is a labor of love, and we appreciate you playing a role in shaping our startup community. Also, a huge thank you to Touchstone Strategic Law for sponsoring this session, Work Smarter Legal Bootcamp. Startup Boston Week could not happen without the support of awesome partners like them. So thank you again for attending Startup Boston Week, and now on to the session.
Hey everyone, my name's Mike.
I'm Elizabeth.
We are the managing partners of Touchstone Strategic Law. We work with startups and want to talk with you guys today about our advice for how to manage the legal needs of your startup. We think there are some key principles that can make the process work for you, feel less intimidating, and less of a hindrance in your drive to move forward quickly. Before we get into it, maybe we introduce ourselves. You want to go
Yeah,
first?
sure. So I've been practicing law headquartered in Boston for about 20 years now. My practice focuses on tax planning, but it's not solely related to taxes, really what the money looks like in general from day one to your eventual exit. Tax planning is essential for that. It's essential for choice of entity, as well as your ongoing operations. I practiced at very large firms and mid-sized firms. Then a couple of years ago, Mike and I founded Touchstone Strategic Law in an effort to provide the same kind of service, but with a little bit more direct, hands-on approach and a more cost-effective price point so that it didn't weigh down businesses too much. I'll let Mike talk about his experience.
Sure. So I've had a few different careers at this point. I started out as a litigator, and I try to bring a sense of how to avoid conflict when advising my clients. Then I helped found a software company, so went through the process of being a co-founder and working as the in-house counsel, and we'll talk a fair amount from that perspective this morning. And now I'm helping startups as outside counsel. We're both based in the Boston area. How many of you guys are Boston area? Everyone? Or is anybody from out of town? Where from? DC. All right, welcome. Just want to get a sense of where you guys are at. So what brings you here today, I guess, who here is an entrepreneur with an idea and an idea only, getting ready to start from the beginning? Oh, that's an awesome place to be. And who started building their idea? Great, so some of you are on your way. Does anybody here have an office? Offices are almost irrelevant now. Yeah, all right. A board? Have you collected a board or a board of advisors? All right, one or two of you. Have you started having revenue, growing in that sense. Okay, so one or two of you with some revenue. And investment? Okay, one with investment. So we can try to think from the position of in many cases, pre-revenue, sort of the process of putting a team together, bringing in the money, and then growing. So in my experience, both in-house and helping startups, lawyers are often threats analogous to zombies. And the analogy sort of works. We're slow, or at least that's the stereotype. We're costly. It could even be deadly. And
Parasitic.
right, yeah. We are the slow type of zombie, though, not the fast type of zombie. And the advice we want to talk about this morning is how to change this relationship from one of kind of fear or necessary evil to one of being a beneficial member of your team. So I'm going to go through a checklist, first of all, of what, in our opinion, are the implications that would lead you to want to consider calling your lawyer. So the first area is if you're encountering something that has implications on the ownership of your company. So there are, for those of you who are solo entrepreneurs with an idea, trying to gather momentum, if you are thinking about bringing on a partner, meaning you're going to split ownership somehow, it's a good idea to consider talking to your lawyer. Same goes with bringing a team in and incentivizing them with equity. The complexities of how to do that legally are one thing, but there's also a lot of creativity that can be applied to how to share ownership of a company. So finding somebody who has done that before and is aware of those options can be really useful, so that you're thinking with nuance about the difference between, say, having an ownership stake that sharing an ownership stake that incentivizes somebody, gives them the opportunity for an exit, versus the dimension of ownership that gives somebody a share of control of the company. And you can think about those differences and how to mix them into an offer to somebody.
And that's part of what I do in my practice quite a bit. And I think it's really important when you're starting up your company, because it relates to how your company is structured, your choice of entity, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. But you can come up with really creative, as Mike said, and beneficial equity ownership in LLCs just as easily as corporations, and not just, plans that will help your key employees, your key team be incentivized to help your company succeed, but that are tax efficient and don't bog down your company's profit.
And ownership of the company is not necessarily immutable. Companies can change entity type, they can be recapitalized. There is flexibility, but it is one of those things where understanding how the road unfolds is a value. So much of what we do in the startup world is kind of with an agile mentality. And I do think some aspects of legal work would benefit from having a more agile mentality. Being careful about ownership of the company is one where the sort of stereotypical, risk-averse, heavily planned approach usually has a lot of
drawbacks.
A lot of benefits.
It's good to have your lawyer involved. That
Right.
makes sense and is cost effective. I mean, I have 4 startups I'm working with right now that have been actually in business for over a year, that in each case on their own decided that S-corps were the way to go. And they want to transition now out to an LLC, but that's not easy anymore. There's real detriment and cost to it. But a little bit, an ounce of prevention, having someone come in, spend a couple of hours talking about structure and what would work for them with their business model and assets which we'll talk about in a minute, would have saved a lot of heartache and money in the long run.
So number 2 on the checklist is intellectual property. And there's a couple instances where this comes up typically. One is before you founded your startup. So you're working your 9 to 5. You may have an employment agreement of some kind. There may be an implication or most often an explicit assignment of some IP from you to your employer. And when you're getting ready to jump ship, thinking about what you can actually take with you and how to do it safely and confidently is one of those instances where lawyers actually can be helpful. And then in my corporate practice, the next most common instance where it comes up is signing your contracts with your customers, with your partners, and with your team once you're building your company. The overall goal, the big lesson that I would say to take away from these intellectual property questions from my perspective is that and the reason why lawyers tend to be helpful around this is that you're papering ownership of your value. And so there may be no conflict. You may be having a very collaborative and friendly conversation with whoever you're working with, whoever you're bringing on. But the document that you're collaborating on becomes a record of who owns what in your collaboration. And then when it comes to your big moments, taking on big investment, getting acquired, that document, more often than not, is going to get looked at. And somebody's going to decide whether you really actually do own the value that you say you do. And so every contract is sort of building this case that defends the value of your company when you want to capitalize on it. So I often advise clients that they can get very familiar with many aspects of a contract, but if there's any doubt in their mind, or if the person they're negotiating with wants to edit the template that I've given them with regard to intellectual property, it's time to talk. And that here, it's another case of where an ounce of prevention has yields.
And I'll pipe in. Look, again, I do a lot of tax, so I'm going to say often that tax matters and is fascinating and fun to talk about. But it also matters for IP and this record of where you're building your value, because if a VC firm was to come in, or somebody was to acquire, it matters whether it's goodwill or non-competes or patents. There's going to be real economic impact to that. So you want to have somebody at least advising you and telling you what to think about on day 1, day 30, as you move forward. And it helps to build that relationship so that you can have a 5-minute call. You have a working relationship. Anything comes up, a question about a contract, you call Mike, talk about his dog, kids, and then you talk about, get your questions answered easily rather than having to build a whole new relationship when a problem arises.
And I don't have a slide for this, but your lawyer should not charge you for talking about their kids.
No, not at all. That dog, that is free.
If you're afraid of that, it's a warning sign about the relationship. So next thing on the checklist is governance of the company. So think who has a vote in the decisions you're going to make. This extends to a certain extent to officers, people who have authority to make decisions in the day-to-day operations. But we're also talking about the board and shareholders. And some equity comes with voting power, some doesn't. So when you're bringing people on and there's a question of are they going to have influence over the company in a concrete way, as opposed to just in the way they're adding value or being persuasive in their day-to-day work, then that's where, again, lawyers can help you plan.
And governance is largely, the tax isn't as central to that, but another point just in general ownership. If you anticipate having any owners or contributors, content producers coming from overseas, Canada, Mexico, that's a great time to call your attorneys because there's going to be treaties coming in play. It affects directly your choice of entity in many cases. For example, Canada hates US LLCs. If you have a US LLC with a Canadian owner, it's going to be a disaster for that. It's going to cause huge shareholder or partner relationship issues. So just a word of warning.
Next on the checklist is compliance. So are any of you in what you would consider regulated industries? Which one? Federal government, yes. Highly regulated by itself and watched by everyone else. Compliance is our word for generally the idea that your operations have to comply with some sort of regulation. So this is a lot bigger topic if you're in healthcare or finance, for example. It's less so if you're generally in kind of consumer software or B2B software that is not in a regulated industry. And compliance is not something where you need your lawyer by your side every day, but and it's one of these instances where I think your lawyer can provide a lot of value with an agile mentality. So let's say a health data startup needs to think about their internal processes for either dealing with personal health data or anonymizing the health data. A lawyer can actually, in my opinion, kind of be a key part of your design team in a sense, and in the sense that design thinking takes into account your resources, where you are on your roadmap, how to provide value in the leanest way as quickly as possible. You have to do that in compliance with the law, and your lawyer can help match up, can go so far as to help match up the features you're deciding between and the ways in which you need to comply with the law most immediately. And then think about within the scope of what kind of resources you have, how you do oversight. Do you have anything to add there?
No, absolutely. So I think that it's worthwhile, as you start up, a lot of young businesses think, well, there's not much, we're just brand new with an idea. We don't really have to worry about this right now. But you're not going to be brand new and tiny forever. If you are going to expand to different countries and different markets, it's worth thinking forward to think, well, what kind of records should I be keeping? What kind of considerations do I have to keep in mind? But also, if there's an exit event or an acquisition, there are lots of private equity buyers, VC buyers that have their own, due to their investor makeup, that have their own compliance requirements, and we know, you want to be talking to a team, an advisor that knows what these investors are going to be looking for, because they might not need you to have complied with every rule for your entire lifespan, but they're going to be looking to do some due diligence and making some assurances to their investors who've asked them to make promises. And it's a lot easier to have that in place so that the acquisition is smooth sailing than it coming up while somebody is talking about investing and then suddenly you're renegotiating value because they think they have some, they're saying, well, we have all these hurdles to jump through. We're going to give you we have to acquire at a discount. So again, just something to think it's worth thinking a little bit ahead.
And I guess one concrete thing I would add is that often what this means early on in the the life stages of a company is at the very least having process. So it might be a plan that you file away and hope to never use, and it might be a very simple plan that says, if there's a breach, here's who I contact, or something along those lines. But the act of having had that plan will help if there is a problem, and then also establish a record of having been
Made good
at
faith
least
efforts,
yeah,
yeah.
at least been minimally compliant or made good faith efforts from the beginning, when it's hardest to find the bandwidth to make these efforts. So contracts with a question mark, it's not on the checklist. And here's where, lawyers may disagree with me, Elizabeth may disagree with me, but I actually am going to say out loud that I don't think every contract or entire contracts always need your lawyer's review. And that it's often a question of, just like anything when you're trying to run a new company, of balancing stakes. So how much money is at stake? What's the strategic importance of the contract?
It's a timeline.
Yeah.
How long is this going to last?
Right, and what are the implications for the future, especially with regard to the things that were on that checklist? So if you're finding that the contract, does implicate governance, ownership, intellectual property, or compliance, then those are weights on the side of the scale for contacting your lawyer. But if those things aren't there, if the money isn't huge, if the strategic importance isn't that high, then especially if you're also familiar with the type of contract it is, then having been a co-founder, I actually think it's a totally reasonable decision sometimes to make, to say, I don't need to spend a few $100s having a lawyer review this.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree. I would definitely keep an eye out for any kind of change in control restrictions, especially for contracts that are multi-year that might renew, because you don't want to be in a position where you have to get somebody's consent all of a sudden to make a move when in a quick and efficient way.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely things to look out for.
Yeah. But generally, I agree with you.
Right, and I always walk away from a presentation having said this, wondering whether I've gotten somebody in trouble. But I want to be, I also want to be genuine about what it's like to start a company, and so I think that checklist slide is a good checklist to have. And it's like when you start seeing things that implicate those things, you can, time to call your lawyer. When, if not, maybe not. Maybe you can review this NDA yourself. Like, I have some clients who send every NDA they receive my way, and it takes me 5-10 minutes to look at it and make sure there's no gotcha in it. But I've, in a few decades of practice, never found a gotcha in an NDA, and so it always makes me wonder whether it's an efficient use of time and resources for the clients. And then another dimension to this is that I would say it can be hard sometimes depending upon what type of firm you're working with or the personalities you're dealing with, but I also think you can feel empowered to ask your attorneys to teach you how to fish in this regard, so to speak. You can ask them to explain, what they've done with your templates, the decisions they've made behind them. You can join in a live review of a new contract you receive with them to understand how they analyze it. And then there can be aspects of these contracts you become highly familiar with that you can sort of check off and then hand your lawyers some specific questions,
Yeah.
as opposed to needing a full
Absolutely.
review.
I mean, your lawyers are a tool for you. It's not the other way around. So if what would help is if an attorney gives you a base contract, some template language, and you want them to write notes on it or annotate it or highlight the important stuff, that's fine. You should ask them because our job is to make it easier for you and more efficient for you. Yeah. Okay, I have no idea why there's a question mark here. Taxes should have like an exclamation point, a smiley face, exclamation, I don't know.
So here's why I put a question mark by it, and then you can emphasize all the ways that question mark is
Yeah.
very faint.
I'm undermining the question mark.
Yeah. Taxes, I put a question mark next to because not every tax question needs a tax lawyer. Some go to an accountant, and often that distinction is difficult to get to know. And so we get a lot of questions where quite often we kick it back and say, talk to whoever prepares your taxes first. And so maybe you can explain
Sure.
where the fuzzy line is between those things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I am going to, I just feel like we should imagine that question mark. I don't know.
An
maybe it's
exclamation point instead?
I don't know,
okay.
semicolon. There's a lot of punctuation there. But it is true that tax lawyers are not the right tool for every problem. For example, like if you have tax returns and it's not efficient or that beneficial for me to review all of your tax returns. Like an accountant, they're better at it. They're trained for that. And you do need to have the right accountant, and that's something that a lot of people starting out don't have, because you might have run into some people who can do personal accounting, but that might not be the best fit for you as you expand your operations and think about your business entity. So ideally, if you have attorneys that are advising you, they can also help recommend great entrepreneurial accounting teams that aren't, that are priced to help you grow, and that are familiar with the structures and tools that small businesses or young businesses need. But for taxes, just to read it, I think the reason why I think that taxes are important and something you should discuss with your attorney isn't necessarily because there's some finite, discrete tax question that comes up. It's more what I referred to in the beginning about your choice of entity when you start. Do you want to be an LLC with a partnership structure where it just flows through? That's pretty agile. Is what many, many young companies begin as that, and it has some flexibility in converting if you need to. Is your business one where an S corporation is right? I think it can be a great tool, but it's a very limited tool. I think it can be overused and can really hamper you if you're not the right fit. Do you want to be a C corp? And a C corp, like if you're going to get venture capital funding down the road, you might need to be a C corp at some point. But also, there's trade-offs. C corps might have more tax inefficiency as an ongoing basis, but for a lot of kinds of companies that start up, that you're putting out there, you might qualify on exit for something called qualified small business stock, and that could exclude up to $10 million of gain from tax, which is a huge, huge benefit. To get that, you have to have operated as a C corporation for a certain amount of time. There's some other requirements that small businesses generally meet, like a valuation requirement when you issue stock to the owners of the stock. So that, I think, choice of entity, how you're operating matters on your day one. It also matters as an ongoing basis. What entity is right for you will depend on what kind of products are out there, what kind of revenue are you generating? Are you generating mostly losses that you want to pass through? When do you think you might have profit and be a taxpayer? And then again, on exit, what a likely buyer? Is it a strategic buyer? Is it a fund? What they might be looking for. And so it's useful to have some really good conversations about that, have someone help you set it up. That doesn't mean they have to handle the entire setup. There's a lot of this that you can do yourself if you want to save on costs. But having someone help you review your operating agreements for whatever you decide, in connection with your attorney, I think makes a lot a lot of sense and can be a huge economic benefit overall. Like that's the goal of what I do. It's to actually add value and add profit and make you a more attractive company, more profitable to the owners and the founders, and then more attractive if you come to an exit event.
Two of the lessons that I learned from having been a co-founder around taxes that, after some flailing and wrong turns, I can now speak in terms of the way I think about it, have to do with sales tax and then kind of this when do I veer towards my tax attorney versus accountant. And so if you're selling anything, there is the possibility of having to collect sales tax. And every one of the 50 states has its own sales tax law with slightly different permutations on some principles in common. And so the sales tax landscape gets complicated fast. And the answer might be that you don't have to collect sales tax, or the answer might be that you're supposed to, but maybe it doesn't make sense to actually do it yet. When I first talked to a tax attorney, when I was still a co-founder of my company, and I first talked to a tax attorney about what we should do, it was sort of this comical conversation where he just kept asking me questions, and I'd ask him questions back, and then he'd ask me questions. And then when I finally started answering my own questions, he was like, yeah, now you're getting it. And it was like this process. It was like I was dealing with Yoda, and there was every answer was fuzzy. And so sales tax is one of those things where it's going to be very difficult to know at any given moment whether you need legal advice or not. And so my take is establishing a connection with somebody who can advise you so that you can touch base with them.
Familiar with your business.
Right, and is familiar with your offering, whatever mix of product and services it might be. And then being able to touch base with them as you go along. And you'll eventually be able to develop a plan for like, all right, when I reach this amount of sales in this state, I need to start really paying attention to this. Or not yet, because the implications will sort of unravel on me and that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I would, that's a great point. I mean, I've worked on a number of exit transactions for sellers in the past 5 or 10 years. I mean, by a number, 20 to 30, where because the sales tax landscape has changed so profoundly as we've entered into a more web-based and virtual marketplace, that sellers, as a business, when you're starting your business, it's not something you think about. You don't want to devote a lot of brain space to like what state is a potential customer, potential user. Where are they, and do we need to file anything? But let me tell you, if you haven't thought about it, and a buyer some buyers come along, they will, like, it's a strategic move on their part. Like, the last transaction that we worked on, the buyer, which a private equity fund, insisted on an escrow amount that was equal. Like, it was the same, it was 50% of the transaction. It was millions and millions of dollars that they wanted to put in a long escrow to cover sales and use tax liabilities. And that might arise. And that sounds, that they may never arise, but it creates a lot of complications because there's nothing to stop buyer unless you have attorneys negotiating the agreement that protect you from the day after that transaction closes, going on and saying, I'm just going to alert all these states and file voluntarily and pay the taxes because I have the money in escrow. This would eliminate risk for me as the buyer. It's not my money, like, I don't need seller to get that money. And it can create it can be a deal killer.
And then one more point on this from me. The distinction that I have come to make between tax lawyer stuff and tax accountant stuff is kind of the tax lawyer sphere is one of compliance and economics, and the tax accountant sphere is more one of numbers. That's not to say that there are a lot of compliance questions that tax accountants can also answer, so that the lines do blur. But that's the rough rule of thumb that I think can help entrepreneurs sort of start one place or the other with their
In
question.
an ideal world, these teams work together too. I mean, with many, ideally, I will be in touch with the accounting team if I have a quick question or if something's more efficient for them to handle. We connect and we, shift. There's not any kind of territoriality there. I know what I'm good at and what I've been trained to do, and the accounting team knows what their sphere is, and it doesn't do anyone any favors for me to try to step in their shoes or vice versa.
All right, so getting sort of into management and operations of your legal team, I've found there's often this question of what kind of lawyer do I need? And on one hand, there's the friendly, collaborative lawyer, and there's the demon, the one that you need to go kill for you. And either one can be useful. The question is which one is the best fit for you in your situation. I've found, having been both types of lawyer and having been inside a company, that in the beginning stages, it's the friendly lawyer that is your most powerful partner, because there's a lot of immature things still forming in your company, having to do with process, ethos, team dynamics, even your brand. And your lawyer becomes a player in all of that. Their personality, their mindset becomes a factor in those things you're trying to develop. And so in my experience, the lawyer you want at these early stages, assuming no conflict has already arisen, is the one that is sort of your spiritual guide that you feel like matches up with the type of company you're trying to build, because they're going to be a member of your team. And do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if you think of your attorney and attorney team, they're the ones that are going to be helping you with your offer letters to employees and trying to onboard them. And you don't want someone who's going to go out with a very adversarial mindset and be combative, because that's going to alienate your leadership team before they come on board. You do want somebody who is confident and skilled enough to be able to pivot a little bit so that they're not pushovers, that somebody can be assertive when needed, and when dealing with third party, that's not going to let you be taken advantage of, and that can assert, wait, no, market is this, not what you're saying, but without being a jerk. And because there are situations where that's helpful. I've had clients, I've had one client that was a private equity fund, and they had 3 law firms. They had a big, top 10 law firm for huge deals when they wanted to be nice. And they had another very large multinational for huge deals where they wanted a different approach that uses language that's not appropriate for the audience, but that was just known that law firm has a reputation for being sharks. And then they had a third lawyer that was where I represented them, which worked with them on more mid-market or smaller deals, and where they wanted to be able to be fair but have a collaborative, cooperative mindset. shifting to, but be able to stand up for them if necessary, because sometimes that aggressive, hostile team was on the other side.
One concrete example that I find comes up a lot is in HR practices. So early on, building a company, in my opinion, is like, it's part building a little family and part building a little society, because you're deciding on the rules about how you're going to treat each other under difficult circumstances, like parental leave. What do we want for ourselves? And I've worked in situations where a lawyer's coming in with the mindset of, how do I grab as much value as possible in this situation and slide it over towards the company without much regard for how that might land on the team. And then I've been around situations where lawyers are thinking more about the bigger picture and what kind of society their clients are trying to create for their larger team. Oops, I already moved on. So the places where I think this friendly lawyer can understand your needs the best and help you accomplish your goals, meet your legal needs most effectively and efficiently are these. As a company, as a founder, you as a human being, you have a certain risk tolerance. Finding a lawyer who can understand your risk tolerance and then help you act accordingly when, say, negotiating a contract can reduce the friction between you and your lawyer. It can reduce the friction during that contract negotiation and produce a lot of efficiency as you attempt to grow under constrained resources. You also, as a founder and a company, have a certain way of dividing labor. And lawyers ought to be, in my opinion, flexible about how they divide the labor of the legal work with you. For instance, a question just came up about reviewing a number of documents for some fairly concrete information. That's a simple, boring topic, but it's an interesting question. Who should do that? A non-lawyer was perfectly capable of doing it. So in some sense, the client could have one of their people do it, find the information, and pass it along for the lawyers. The lawyer could have paralegals that could do it at a lower rate, saving bandwidth for the company. This kind of question should not be like a foregone conclusion that is forced on you. It should be one where you establish the answer in collaboration with your lawyer. I keep accidentally pressing the button, sorry.
Sorry,
go ahead.
and also if you find a lawyer where you have a meeting of minds and hearts, you really feel like they're on board and understand your mission, that's a great choice for your board of directors too, because you get that legal advice baked in, somebody who can really speak to a lot of the issues we've discussed at your board of directors meetings. Then you have sort of built-in records and good faith efforts.
And somebody who's
real value add.
Somebody who's giving you solid advice about when to contact counsel, outside counsel or not. So the other two other areas where I think your lawyer should work hard to align with you. One is your brand and how your brand appears to the outside world. As a lawyer, eventually I am part of your team interacting with somebody of strategic importance to you. And if I'm a jerk, that's not good for you. And if I don't present well in some of the basic human ways in terms of your brand, but also if I don't understand what kind of company you are and how you're trying to represent yourself to your audience, then maybe I'm helping a little, but I'm not helping the way I should. And then, a lot of what goes into a startup at these early stages is your heart. You believe in an idea. You want to, have a huge exit, but you also believe in enough in the idea to really sweat it out at these tough early stages. And I've found that finding a lawyer that, if you're lucky enough to find a lawyer that has a personal connection to the thing that your company is involved in, that's great. It helps motivate them. Or that at least can relate and understand to the space you're in generally. That's sort of an intangible that will pay dividends as you build a relationship with your lawyer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think of attorneys ideally in a very old-fashioned sense as advisors and counsel, not as a like somebody who comes in for a specific transaction or a specific need, but somebody who can really be a value add and somebody who you rely on and a team member throughout your whole life cycle.
So we wanted to, now we can get a little even more concrete. Here's 3 scenarios. We're going to ask you guys to kind of vote on which one sounds the most applicable or most interesting to you right now, and you can ask questions about them, or the one we get to dive into, and we can point out the considerations that go into them. So we've got, one is you and your co-founder have an idea, you've written some code, created some designs, prototyped, you've put some code on GitHub or blogged about it, an angel investor wants in. Next one is you're a Delaware corporation based in Massachusetts, you've launched your product, you've got a big new customer in Seattle, and you're hiring 2 developers based in Austin. And last but not least, you've got a vision, maybe a co-founder along with it, maybe you formed a business entity, maybe you've started building the product, but you haven't quit your day job yet. So who is most interested in hearing about X? All right, we got 7 or 8, some 8.5 maybe. Y? Several there, so maybe we'll go with Y. Z? Not so many. Okay, you've all quit your day job already. So we'll start with X, I guess.
I feel like X was
we don't necessarily have to go through in the structure of these check marks, but these are some angles that we can take on it. Does anybody, maybe just to keep you all involved, does anybody have a specific question about this scenario, like something that popped into their mind as they read it? Oh, thank you. Yeah.
I'm interested in getting investment while also not compromising too much of founders' equity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a priority, particularly in your early days, because you don't want to, giving away equity, it is a dilutive event and it reduces the value, reduces your voice. So there are ways, if you have somebody who wants to come in, there are different roles that person could take. If they're going to be in any way a service provider, not just an employee, but somebody on the board of directors, anybody who is providing sort of value to the company, there are different incentive kind of values where, especially say an LLC, you can give them a profits interest. That's equity, can be non-voting. You can set a threshold where they're not participating until you hit a certain level of profits. You can have restricted units in an LLC, a corporation. S corps, again, are tricky because you can't have, there are limitations on the classes of stock. You can only have one class of stock, so it really restricts you on what you can give and the kinds of limitations on control or voting. But, this is a question we advise on quite often, I think.
Yeah, so there are, mechanically, there are types of offerings you can make that literally don't offer actual equity. So many of you may have heard of the safe note. Mm-hmm. This is an agreement that provides some parameters for the person to acquire equity later.
Mm-hmm. Could go with debt.
Right. There's also convertible debt, which gets a little more concrete and is not quite as favorable to the startup. but that is not actually handing over any equity right away. And then, as Elizabeth touched on, there are dimensions to equity that you can control, and it doesn't have to be sort of the prototypical share of stock that comes with both ownership and voting rights. My advice to founders for how to approach this has two kind of principles. One is be the first to make the offer. So in these early stages, you might be talking to potential angel investors, folks who are sort of part advisor, part potential investor. I think it works out better to put an offer in front of them rather than to accept their, not accept, but to take their offer and consider it. So I think when you, part of the planning that can go into kind of getting ready to go out there in the world is to say, all right, at this stage, I want to offer safe notes. So I'm going to get my template safe note together. I'm going to get maybe like a one-page summary that explains what it is. And that's going to be a part of my packet that I hand people when we start to get serious. And then...
And that helps. You look like you know what you're doing. You set the parameters. You set the general outline of what people are going to be thinking about. It just gives you a lot more control, and that's what you want.
And then the second thing I always recommend is think creatively, but without regard to the legalities. Like, just forget that for a second and think, okay, in an ideal world, what am I offering this person? What would I like to withhold? What would I like to offer? And think about that in, whatever terms it occurs to you in your own mind. You can hand that to a lawyer, and a lawyer can interpret that into an agreement or tell you, like, this isn't really going to work, but we could try this other thing. So start with, often clients come to me, I think, trying to speak my language, and it's restricting how well their minds can work because they're trying to fit within these boxes that they've read a little bit about. And my advice is always forget all that. Think about how you would make it work if you were just entering into a handshake with somebody, and then come to us, and we make it look legal.
Yeah, we're here to help the business deal get done, to help you be what you want to be. It's not to have your lawyers impose some kind of rigid or structure on you.
Yeah, lawyers hopefully are facilitators, not people who just say no over and over again. So any other questions or thoughts on this one? We can touch on the next one since a bunch of people are into that too.
If one of the founders is going to be also providing bootstrap funding, how does that relate? Like, should they be using a SAFE for that, or does it just end up being interpreted in the proportion of ownership?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's no one right answer. It kind of depends on, there's two parties there, and it's a little bit tricky because when you're working with one lawyer who, your lawyer is going to be thinking for the company, right, in some fundamental sense. But thinking more broadly than that, there's the company's interests. So you as a company you can think about, without regard to who the person putting that money is, like, how important is that money to you? What do you want to give away for it? And that helps drive your preferences around what the structure of it is. The founder who's putting the money in may have a multiple or very different risk tolerance, risk profiles with regard to it. Like, so a founder could just give a loan, not wanting a huge return, but wanting a higher likelihood of getting the money back. A founder could just put it in and say, in exchange for, this is what I want as my founder's share of the company. That's the highest risk, highest reward.
Could be a hybrid.
Right, exactly, or splitting it up somehow. Yeah, exactly. All right, should we try the next one before we run out of time? So as a refresh, you're a Delaware corporation headquartered in Massachusetts. You've launched your product. You've got a big new customer in Seattle. That could be any city outside of Massachusetts. And you're hiring 2 new developers based in Austin. That also could be anywhere outside of Massachusetts. So of those of you who are intrigued by this scenario, do you have any initial questions?
So in our case, we're looking at having basically 50 nexuses. We're trying to scale up to 50 nexuses at the same time. How does that complicate? That's going to complicate things, I know that, but on your side, how would that be resolved?
In
there?
terms of your product offering or your team?
Both.
Oh, wow, okay.
One thing with team, though, that we haven't mentioned, we won't go into in depth, is that you also have to consider whether you're bringing people on as employees or independent contractors. There are lots of considerations.
Full-time
and-
employees in our case, 2 per state, 1 marketer, 1 sales. Just, yeah.
Yeah.
So, the implications, I'm sure you've already sort of stepped into this, but for everyone else, are that there are going to be basically taxes and fees potentially owed to all 50 states in this situation. And on top of that, there's a bunch of administrative burden you're probably dealing with, like registering with all these state agencies and now having to keep up with whatever cadence
Certificates of good
of
standing.
reporting and that they require. This is a tricky situation that a lot of people are in because basically our governments haven't caught up to the way the world now works with remote work and web-based products. And so this isn't a great answer for you, but there's 2 thoughts. One is there is software that often integrates with your payroll or your sales related software that helps set up structures. And so these software attempt to take each state's different rules and turn it into conditions, basically, that when a particular invoice meets the conditions of these product offerings in this place, it knows to add the sales tax. And in some sense, it's a simple logic that the software applies. In another sense, it's 5 minutes, you said? 2 minutes, okay. It's a little tricky because the state law sort of has more subtlety and changes a little bit faster than these software can keep up with. But if you are attempting at least to be compliant with this kind of software, then you've limited your liability risk considerably. And then, sorry.
And having an attorney come in that is familiar with these kinds of questions that can advise you practically on your risk exposure. Some states are more aggressive than others. States have wildly different thresholds for triggering compliance. And attorney, your team can say, well, you really have to worry if you're doing a lot in California, if you've got an employee in California. Well, I think that one of the lessons we haven't talked about.
Let's talk afterwards. Yeah.
But-
So the approach that I took inside my own company was to basically, and you could find different variations on this, was basically start building a decision-making spreadsheet for myself and I don't know if all 50 states are happening at once for you or if it's gonna happen over the course of a certain amount of time. But basically, as we expanded to more and more states, I had a spreadsheet that sort of told me, all right, here are the dollar amount thresholds or the number of people thresholds that trigger to me, okay, I need to start dealing explicitly with this state. And I developed those sense of thresholds through working with outside counsel and then my own legal research. And so it's like, it's a strange space to be saying there are no perfect answers. Like you think of taxes as something that ought to be mechanical.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's not. And so but the opportunity because of that dynamic is to do something that makes sense, that is, internally consistent in terms of efforts to be compliant, and that helps marry your own needs as a startup and your resource constraints with the need to avoid liability. But we should definitely talk. Do we have any time for like a last question, or are we done?
No, we'll have to wrap it up.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to put out some business cards.
I didn't get to my fantastic
Oh, yeah.
presentation ending jokes. Can I take one more minute?
Okay, one joke.
Okay. All right. So the dirty little secret that I wanted to pass along is just that you can do a lot of this stuff, and that you can manage your legal team. There are things you can DIY, and it's just a matter of sort of understanding risk. To me, it's like fixing your house. I don't know how many of you are homeowners, but you get into the plumbing, you do it. You might have to call a professional 5 years later, but in that moment, it's what makes sense. The same goes for your company. You just, in an agile sense, you accumulate legal debt the same way you tolerate technical debt, and you just sort of stay aware of that legal debt and understand that you need to address it when you get that next investment round in and have the money to. And then hopefully your relationship with your lawyer zombie is not so bad. Thanks so much, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the tolerance.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure having you. Thank
I'm
you.
going to put out some business cards because I don't have a lot of opportunity to give them out these days.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, you can hang around, connect with the speakers as well. And today we have a lot more in store for both today and the...
You got them from Moo?
Yeah, we have a lot more in store for today and the rest of the week. We have the startup crawl happening tonight, which kicks off at 6 p.m. right here from Suffolk University. And right here in this room specifically, the next session is a panel